Welcome to this evening's event, everyone. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Maggie Crosland with us, who's going to be talking to us about her experiences curating the Global Connections Gallery at St. Louis Art Museum, which features works ranging from 500 to 1500 CE. Before I introduce her fully, though, I want to briefly introduce the Athena Art Foundation. My name is Abigail Spencer, and I'm the Digital Events Manager for Athena. We're a UK-based arts charity operating primarily online, founded by our director, Nicola Jennings. Our mission is to engage more audiences with pre-20th century art from all around the world in a fun way which brings more people into museums and galleries and also demonstrates its continued relevance today. So we also often speak to contemporary artists who choose to explore the past and different traditions in their artworks. You can take a look at our social media on our Instagram for shorter videos about the stories behind artworks, or on our YouTube for recordings of recent events with Susan Strong, curator of the V&A exhibition The Great Mughals, or with Jane Simketh, who is curator at Compton Verney and who spoke to us about a fascinating painting known as Two Women Wearing Cosmetic Patches. We also have a website where you can find more materials on different exhibitions going on around the world on pre-20th century art and sign up to our newsletter and find links to other resources there. So Dr. Maggie Crosland is the Faris Gambrel Lynn and Henry Sharp Lynn Curator of European Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art in Alabama. She's a specialist of late medieval and Northern Renaissance art with a particular interest in illuminated manuscripts. She previously served as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellow in Late Medieval European Art at the St. Louis Art Museum, a position that was jointly held with the Art History and Archaeology Department at Washington University in St. Louis. In this position, she curated Global Connections 500 to 1500, a permanent gallery installation focused on connections in global artistic production in the so-called Middle Ages. Maggie received her MA and PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art and has previously held positions at the Art Institute of Chicago, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Wyvern Collection. So on to our talk for this evening. Maggie, can you give us an introduction to what is on display in the Global Connections Gallery and how you intended audience to experience these as they walked around the space?
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for Judy Mann, who's on the call, for suggesting we talk about global Middle Ages, but it's a thrill to be with you all this evening or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. And it's a real treat to get to I'm no longer at SLAM and in Alabama. I think to get into your question, maybe it's good to go to the next slide to see an install shot of the gallery. But Global Connections 500 to 1500 is a reinstallation of and a reconfiguration of works from the so-called Middle Ages, so the years 500 to 1500. It's 54 artworks from the permanent gallery of the St. Louis, or permanent collection of the St. Louis Art Museum, that span from Western Europe, Byzantium, Africa, the Americas, and across Asia. And the gallery was a project that I conducted as a postdoctoral fellow, or curated as a postdoctoral fellow, that the charge was to rethink this gallery. So I'm showing Judy's beautiful installation of the gallery before my installation that focused on the Western Middle Ages, and to think about this bigger, broader concept of the global Middle Ages. And the gallery sort of initially was thought of as, how is Europe thinking about global, or how is Europe engaging with global art history and production? But in conversations with curators at SLAM and other specialists, we kind of quickly realized that we needed to take a different type of tact. We thought of different ideas of maybe focusing on permanent collection items that, spanned one century, like the 13th century. Realized that wasn't going to work either. And so the gallery, as it came out in its final iteration, focuses on what are the connections that can be found in artistic production and reception across the permanent collection from this year 500 to 1500. And we've tried to do that in different ways. Some of this includes trade routes, so thinking about discrete objects made for trade routes or along trade routes. Some things are about, if we go to the next slide, that would be good too. Some things are about technologies or artistic forms that art that are kind of begun or invented in one place and transmitted and translated across space and time to other places. Some of the connections are broader themes like bodily ornament. How are people decorating themselves and life and death across the world at different moments? And a really key connection is the fact that all of these objects are in one collection now. They've all, against all odds, have come to this one collection in St. Louis. And that was a really key tie for thinking about how we include the ancient Americas within this broader concept that is called the global Middle Ages. We can talk about this a little bit. I know one of the questions is sort of about this at the end, but for those of you who are not aware, St. Louis in particular, this applies to all museums in North America, but St. Louis stands in an area that has a deep, deep artistic history and long-lasting history of Native Americans in this site, including most importantly, the Mississippian people. So trying to include that narrative within this was incredibly important. How the gallery is structured, there's sort of we'll go through some install shots. It's a kind of a funny space. You can see two doorways in this installation shot, but there's actually a third doorway off to the left or to the right of this photo. So it is a space that we have these big themes, but it's a space that does not really allow for an obvious beginning and an obvious end. So one of the goals of the gallery was that no matter what direction you walked in, you could pick up on one of these threads, and that hopefully the flow or the installation lets you kind of go in any direction, and you can kind of pick up a theme of where you left off in different ways and in different nuances. So I'll kind of walk you around in a series of photos to give you a sense. But this is the view if you start the gallery from, I called it entrance 1. There is no specific 1, 2, or 3, but this is one of the entrances looking into a case of Mesoamerican works. And if we go to the next slide. And this is sort of the view out of that gallery into a gallery of European but Italian Tre and Quattrocento gold ground paintings. So I wanted to also play with things like the German monstrance and thinking about the shapes that you would see across those gallery spaces. If we go to the next gallery, or next shot, this is entrances 2 and 3. So so there's an entrance. This is what you see when you come in on one side, on the left and on the right. So you can pick up in Mesoamerica, you can pick up in Africa, and you can pick up in Spain and Persia. And those are sort of the main places that you can start as walking through the galleries. Go to the next slide. And this is the view out of one of these galleries. One of the things that I think became very apparent, especially as we were creating the installation, but also as we were actually installing, is that there's a really big difference between thinking about flows of exhibitions and flows of permanent gallery spaces. Exhibitions often have, direction and flow and a narrative built through in a very particular way. And with permanent collection galleries, you're lucky if you have someone stay for 5 minutes. So the goal is, even if if a visitor doesn't even make it to the text panel, at least they can try to pick up one theme and get the sense that something different is happening in this space. Go to the next slide. So this sort of starts kind of our whirlwind tour around the gallery, but to give you a sense of how I hoped things would flow together. This is a corner that's looking into, or kind of into the center of the gallery at the Mesoamerican case that's kind of front and center here. But off to the right, there's a case of a terracotta sculpture from Jennings, which is the oldest city in sub-Saharan Africa and a really, really important place on the trade routes of gold and salt across the Sahara from West Africa into Europe and the Islamic world. And if we go to the next case or next photo, I wanted to take that theme and use that Jennings figure to show show artistic production along a very important trade route and connect it to to two ends of that trade route. So on the right in the back, there's a case of Akan gold weight. So they're brass and bronze gold weights to measure gold dust from present day Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And then that case of this, I mean, absolutely gorgeous French reliquary hand with very thick gold sheeting to show the ends of that trade route and also what's produced along that trade route. Then, of course, some Gothic ivories off to the side, but we can dive into those later if we want to. If we go to the next slide. So this is pivoting behind that Jenny figure. You can sort of see off to the right, you get in more to Western Europe. In this section, I wanted to think about travel as a way of Europeans thinking about the world a little bit more broadly. So St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers, but also objects like books of hours that let you access virtual travel. So there's a case for a book of hours that rotates, the opening rotates every 6 months. The next slide. As you come through Europe, you're faced into this case of ceramics sort of to the back and a large panel painting from Spain. And I think if you go to the next slide, you'll get a better sense of that case. This is a case that in 4 objects, and then there's a 5th in the back, but in 4 objects tries to tell the story of the history of lusterware. So lusterware is, people on this call will likely know, but it's you know, a tin or metallic glazed ceramics. And the story of this in this case is if you start on the far left, you have a dingware Chinese porcelain bowl that shows its transparent glaze over bright white porcelain. And then next to it, a Persian little jug that is not made of porcelain, but it is using different glazes to mimic the white of porcelain because they didn't have, they had access to the trade of porcelain, but not access to kaolin clay. And then that sort of transforms into lusterware. So the small bowl on the left is another Persian work showing, if you get up close, you can really see the shine of lusterware, which is a technique that is then transmitted across and adapted across the Islamic world. And then sort of the end point of this case is the large charger from Spain that you can see, I think, a really nice connection between colors and forms of a Persian artwork and a Spanish artwork that are made about 2 or 3 centuries apart. So you can sort of see that translation. Behind this case, to try to keep this kind of connection going, on one side you have the Spanish panel painting, but on the other, a case of Asian ceramics. It was really important, I think, to everyone working on this project that we had moments in the gallery that did not connect specifically to Europe. And this is one of these cases where we focused on shape, the melon form in particularly, as it begins in Qingbai glazes in China, and then kind of spreads to Korea very quickly. It's adapted in Korea very quickly. So the object at the end of the case, the larger jug, is a Korean vase. So transmission of form, but also glazes. The little dish that's kind of high up on that case is a small dish from Thailand. And there is quite a long moment where Thai ceramic production and celadon production is sort of competing with Chinese celadon production. So what is happening between different ceramic production within and across Asia? If we go to the next slide. So that's another view of that connection, of seeing the ends of that case in different ways on the wall. And then if you come back around this gallery, you come back to this ancient American case, but in the far background, there's a wall case of bodily ornament. So this was a case that kind of started because the museum has a pair of Merovingian fibulae, which are completely an outlier in the European collection. They don't connect well due to basically just centuries of time to the rest of the European collection. But it provided an opening to think across the collection of different types of ornaments that people are using from sort of an earlier moment. So the case mostly focuses on like 500 to 900 with a pair of Unified Shilla dynasty ear pendants from Korea, a pair of Maya jadeite ear flares, and a Tang Dynasty mirror. And then there's a little bit later underneath. You could just see it as a little speck, but it's an obsidian Mishtek libret. So it includes Europe to China to Korea to ancient America within one case of how are people ornamenting themselves in life and death. So that is the quick and long overview of this gallery.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So jumping off of that, because it's such an amazing, complicated space that you've created, how was researching the project, particularly when you were looking into the material and written evidence for all of these global connections?
It's a great question because I think, there's been such a push within medieval studies to think about global connections. And I think this was a really fun way to think about the challenges of being a European specialist entering into this and the really careful tact that you have to take. I think the first step that I really needed to take in this was just to get very comfortable with what the current literature is on the so-called global Middle Ages, looking at scholars like Geraldine Hang, what the Brian Keane, formerly of the Getty, has been doing in academic spaces and teaching spaces, but also what other museums have been doing in smaller, bigger settings to kind of get a sense of how the field is moving to thinking about this. To be honest, the biggest aspect of research with this was that I started at the museum in July of 2021, and not only did I have to get to grips with the field of the global Middle Ages, but I had to learn this collection very quickly. And I think it's not necessarily exactly research, but so much of the success of this project was building, relationships built on trust with my colleagues in other curatorial departments, to learn what there was in the collection, to then figure out what I needed to research to make the connections across objects. Because it was something that I quickly realized I couldn't go in with an idea of how I wanted it to go because I did not know anything about the unified Shilla dynasty in Korea. I did not know anything about the history of obsidian production in Mishtek cultures. And I could only learn how to research that after I really got to grips with what the collection allowed.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like a brilliant experience and quite to really get into a collection so quickly. And I think it's so amazing that this is also part of a permanent collection rather than we've had quite a few exhibitions in the UK that look at different connections. Often we've had a couple that centre around the Silk Roads in London in the past year. Um, and we've also heard how you used quite an awkward space to curate something that worked to your benefit with this sort of spiraling multi-directional um, path of these connections that makes the most out of having multiple entrances. Were there any other challenges you found you faced when you were creating a permanent gallery space that so notably departs from what's the dominant canonic curation of art history, which is quite Eurocentric and probably would have labeled this under a term like medieval galleries? Or would you say that, as you've mentioned, the interdepartmental collaborations with other curators and examples by these other institutions help to reduce those obstacles?
Um, I think that is like the central question to be asking on projects like this. Um, there were definitely challenges where I think some of them were easily identifiable from the beginning and some of them that just very much weren't. I think one of the big challenges when creating and like conceiving of a gallery that's going to be the global Middle Ages or the global anything is thinking through parity of how you actually balance what you're showing. And a limitation that will always exist is what is in a permanent collection. I think there are very few examples that if anyone is wondering, well, you've included, a Khan in West African works, but you've not included you've included West Africa, but not East Africa. It's because there were no objects available to show in the collection. There's one Ethiopian work that was not available for the installation. We had hoped at one point to have a long-term loan of cases of Ethiopian material, but institutional policy meant that we couldn't have international loans in a permanent gallery space at that moment. So there were some bureaucratic challenges. There are big gaps, and it's a huge collection of material at this time period, but they're just naturally large gaps. I know we'll talk about some of the Native American, but there was an unexpected gap in that one. We were really hoping to include works produced very locally to not just the St. Louis region, but sort of the center of what is now the United States. But there were reasons why we had to shift away from that. So I tried to think about parity in different ways, try to resolve this in different ways. One of the things that we did with our learning and engagement team was we conducted a survey before I started writing labels, which usually we have surveys after a project is up to see how visitors have responded. But we sort of took a different tactic to try to get their input from the beginning, including questions like, what do you want from a gallery on the Middle Ages? And what do you expect from a gallery on the Middle Ages, to see what the difference of those questions were, which were really interesting. But one of the questions we asked was, if you have a label that has an extended chat, so, a paragraph, and a label that's just a tombstone, do visitors assume that museums are making a statement of importance about objects? And 100% of the responses were yes, they do think that museums are making a statement of importance. So every work in this gallery got a label. There are a few group labels, and even within those, each object is discussed specific or referenced specifically to say we can't represent everything equally, but we can treat them equally within the space. Size of works, the scale of works was also something that was considered. There were a few bigger European sculptures that I really did want to include, but we had some great feedback from speaking with medievalists at WashU who were not art historians, that skewing scale could accidentally indicate a visual hierarchy when you walked in the space of what was more important. So we really tried to keep with smaller scale works across the board, with a few exceptions, to try to signal parity where we could in other ways. So those were some challenges that had to be kind of thought about differently. But so much of the success of this gallery and why we were able to include 54 things from almost every curatorial department came down to what I truly believe is the specific collaborative nature of the curatorial division at the St. Louis Art Museum. I know that different museums are siloed in different curatorial departments are siloed in different ways. You might have different bureaucratic structures of like internal loan agreements that literally include forms and requests. That was not the case. It was very important to me from the beginning to get buy-in from the other curators and not to go in with my own expectations, but to really learn what each of the curators wanted from a project like this, where they were worried about different perceptions that have historically been placed on their collections, what was available, and I had to create different working methods with each curator, which was really interesting. So some curators wanted a more hands-on approach to selecting artworks. Some wanted more hands-on in the writing and editing of labels. But because of being able to sort of negotiate individually with different departments and different curators, it meant that I had no challenges from like an internal standpoint. And I don't think if I didn't have that, I don't think a project like this would be possible. And I think that's sometimes why I can't speak for other institutions, but I can imagine that could be quite a barrier if you don't have that same kind of collaborative mindset from the beginning with a project.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like you had a brilliant array of artworks that you were able to borrow from, but also I think the intentionality that you've done that with does come through as well. And anyway, so my last question is, so the room is centered around these Mesoamerican works that we can see in the cabinet on the left there. And I've heard from you, speaking to you previously, that can be a very complicated chain of legal proceedings when you're working with artworks that belong to Indigenous American communities or have heritage that would lead up to present day Indigenous American communities. So obviously acknowledging you are not a legal professional in this field, could you tell us a little bit about how this has impacted the experience of curating these objects or any sort of new insights it's prompted to you from that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. This case of the Mesoamerican works is one of my absolute favorite cases in the show or in the installation. I think, especially with it like that sort of vista to the St. Christopher, I think it really has shaped the gallery. This case was not meant to be there. The plan from the very beginning is that we were going to have three Mississippian or two Mississippian and one Caddo works of ceramic works from the cultures that that historically lived in the region where St. Louis is. I mentioned the importance of the indigenous history of the region around St. Louis. To give context, 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from downtown St. Louis, across the Mississippi River in Illinois, is the site of Cahokia, which was the largest ancient American city north of Mexico. In this period, and especially around like 900 to 1400, had a population that was larger than Paris or London. I mean, it was a major, major city with major artistic production. And this is a history that has effectively been erased. And St. Louis St. Louis used to be called Mound City because of all the ancient American earthenwork mounds that were there. And there's only one that remains because they've all been systematically dismembered and dismantled to build the city that is now St. Louis. So the plan had been that we were going to include works by Mississippian and Caddo artists and like from that region of the same time period to really root this installation in the local of this broader 500 to 1500 time period. And then that had been the case the whole way through. I worked very carefully with Amy Clark, who is a curatorial assistant at the St. Louis Art Museum, but is a specialist in Mississippian and ancient American art. And in late 2023, January 2024, there was an important and pretty substantial change to a piece of legislation called NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is legislation that was enacted in 1990 that I'm going to give the barest overview of this because I am not, as you said, Abigail, I am not a legal scholar, but nor am I an Indigenous specialist. So that needs to be stated very firmly. But it is legislation that is meant to protect Native American grave sites, but also to give guidance and rules about how material can be displayed and when it needs and how to repatriate works. And in particular, human remains. But for the change in early 2024 completely changed how museums have to go about identifying what is considered important cultural patrimony and how the steps you have to go through to even display works that are allowed to remain in collections. And so the key thing is that museums are required, which is a great thing, to have input and a conversation with Native American nations and tribes about how to display works from their cultural heritage. This is a very lengthy process. Every tribe and nation in the country is now being inundated with requests by every museum for this. So this is not a straightforward and easy task. And so we had to make a decision. And when I say at the last minute, I mean, like there was down to 2 weeks, like we had like 2 weeks to 7 days pretty much we had to say we were not going to display that case. We were going to have to dig into Mesoamerica and to think, because the legislation only applies to the bounds of the current borders of the United States, and to think about ancient America from outside the borders of the US. What was available, what was not currently on view, so what was in storage, what made sense, what was in the condition to be displayed without any treatment, and to write and edit labels within like a 2 week period before labels and cases went into production. And I cannot thank Amy Clark enough for all the effort she provided in helping select these three. If we go to the next slide, just like a behind the scenes as Judy and Amy and I were in storage, kind of laying out, not just selecting things to fit in the case, but to pick things quickly that really did speak to the theme of the gallery. And so we chose these three because they are incredibly beautiful, dynamic figures, but they come from three different ancient American city-states and civilizations. So on the left, there's a small, she's actually a whistle. So she's a female figure with a whistle, that she's Maya. The center figure is Zapotec. So from like present day Oaxaca. And the figure has these, these beaded necklace, but these ear spools, the ear flares that speak very nicely to the ear flares that are in the bodily ornament case. And then the figure on the right is Huastec, so from present day Veracruz. So it's three different ways of thinking about the human body in ceramic form in Mesoamerica. So that was like maybe the biggest challenge of the installation was coming up with this very quickly and shifting very quickly due to federal legislation, but also in a way that this one, it is, I had been preparing and researching for this gallery, but I had not been thinking about Mesoamerican ceramics for the 3 years on the lead up to this gallery and had to pivot very, very quickly. So I think this is one of these moments that was perhaps the most challenging of the installation.
Thank you so much. It does feel like it worked in the end, that random switch. They really are a highlight. Like you can see they work in the room very well, even without being able to actually go and wander around it with um yeah.
Yeah, it
And
was
there's so many
very,
great works in the room. I encourage everyone in the audience to go and look at the SLAM website afterwards, any of the ones you want to see more close up and read about. But now I think we have quite a bit of time, 20, 25 minutes if we need them for any audience questions. If you want to place them in the Q&A box, we will go through them. Um,
Hi. So I'm going to read the questions out. There's one question so far from Ramses Luquis Ortega, and he asks, how was the local community engaged after completing the curatorial work?
that is a great question. I This is, the funny thing about curatorial jobs is that I left the museum before this was installed, and came back for the installation. I do know that they have done and are doing extensive surveying of visitors of this space. And I think interestingly, I think there's been a lot of interesting statistics about how long people stay in the gallery, and I don't think there had been great statistics leading up to this about how long people stay in galleries and read labels, or at least hadn't been done in quite a while in this way. And I think they really found out that people stay less than 5 minutes within the gallery space. I think that has led to some people going like, I walked in from a Renaissance gallery and I was very confused about why this was here, which I think is something to think about doing spaces like this in the future. But I also think that actually is kind of a win, is not just giving people what they expect. But I'm hoping more. I think it's a great question because I hope more surveying is done to really kind of get into the nuances of how people have responded.
yeah, it's definitely, it must be quite telling that that's been a response you've had of confusion going into it, that you are doing something that's quite innovative and changing the way that stories of art history might be told.
I hope so.
Um,
I have a couple of questions, Maggie. Thank you so much. That's so interesting, and I wish I could come to go to St. Louis and see it. Maybe one day I will. Um, I know Maggie from the Courtauld where we both studied, so meeting an old friend. Um, So I was really interested. I mean, I was going to ask you about how visitors reacted, which you've just spoken about. But I also wondered how your colleagues, curatorial colleagues, have reacted. Because it's interesting, I guess, when you work in a museum, maybe this isn't the case at St. Louis, but I think when you work in a big museum, like, for example, the British Museum in London, which has a huge collection which ranges like yours does across different cultures and different time periods. As I understand it, people tend to be very, as you said earlier, siloed, and they're very specialized in their own thing. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to actually come out of that and see, gosh, so that's what was happening, in this other part of the world. And I think we as art historians, maybe because we've been studying more recently, are reading about these things, but I'm not sure that, if you were a specialist in one particular area and you weren't necessarily in a museum where there was a lot of collaborative discussion, it might be quite shocking, or, I'd be very interested to know how different colleagues, has it led them to think about their objects in a different way, or to do different kinds of research, or seek out more connections?
I mean, I think one of the things, it doesn't specifically answer sort of the afterthought, but fun about working with everybody is that there are examples like there's Zapotec figures in the Mesoamerican galleries. In there's Spanish lusterware in the decorative arts galleries. There's Persian lusterware in the Islamic galleries that are all have different types of interpretation with different narratives and different stories. And what was very fun about this was that I could have conversations with those curators about, you've done it this way, what's missing? It also became like, especially for the Asian ceramics. So some curators were fine with me saying, this is on view in this case, can I have it? And some were, you cannot take anything that is currently on view, you have to pull entirely from storage, which, like, for the Asian ceramics was a really fun example where I came up with some harebrained idea that I don't even remember exactly what it was. And I took it to Philip, who's the Asian curator, who's a delight. And Philip was like, no, you can do better. And then we spent, a day in storage looking at artworks and had conversations about what things he wished he had room to put out. And so we were able to, kind of use how he had been thinking about other displays of what he didn't get to do and incorporating that into the gallery. And we tried as much as possible on labels to say, if, for more works on this, go to this gallery. We tried to make it kind of pointing out into other spaces. I'm not there anymore, so I'm not privy to like the day-to-day conversations. I think this was very much a test case for how the museum wanted to rethink thematic galleries. So I'm excited to see what the sort of the next steps for the museum are.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, about whether people said you can't have that object, it's the central feature of my case, on this or something like that. So that's quite funny. But actually, I wanted to say, I think you should run for president one day, Maggie, because you sound like you're such a great negotiator. Like this idea of bringing people, getting people on board. It's one of the first things they teach you in leadership skills, and you clearly understood that straight away and did it brilliantly. So congratulations.
Well, I was very lucky that I did not have anyone I needed serious convincing.
Yeah. So there is another question. Lara Dunn asked, well, she says, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I was wondering whether you think there will be any push in the future to try again to display the local local historical artistry.
That is, this is something that is beyond my expertise and purview, but I think every museum is grappling with this and how to do this. I think the legislation was very well-meaning, but stories have continued to be displaced because of this. I know St. Louis is working very hard on they have a specific curator of Native American art who has really put at the forefront ties with tribes and communities and having those perspectives as part of everything he does. So I know that that museum is working very hard to do this. This is something that we're also in the middle of working on at the Birmingham Museum of Art, where I am now, where we've had to take a large portion of our Native American collection off view. We are trying to address it in the moment with different panels explaining what NAGPRA is and that legislation, why we as the museum have made the choices we have to take things down, and how we are working with communities. I know for the 3 works that I had hoped were going to be in this case, like those are, in the process of getting cleared and getting input from communities about how to display them. So maybe I hope in the not too distant future they will, but like great effort is being taken to make sure that those histories come back into museum spaces with better interpretation guided by tribal nations.
I have another question, Maggie, which is that now that you're in Alabama, right? So have you taken this approach with you? Are you doing anything similar in Alabama? Or is it a very different kind of museum?
I certainly plan to. It's also an encyclopedic collection, but very different in its collection holdings. So very strong Mesoamerican, not as strong in like the Mississippians were also here. There was also a mound building here. It's just a different set of challenges. Also in this role, I oversee all of Europe up until 1970, which is really fun for a medievalist. But I'm trying to take sort of some of the lessons of this about thinking about sitting in a European position, but thinking globally in different ways. We're doing a big French modernist exhibition coming up in January, and one of the things that has been very important is thinking about Alabama history within European history. So I'm trying to like include Alabama women within a show that you may not expect them to appear in. I'm trying to take lessons of this and think about it beyond the Middle Ages into other practice. We don't have plans to reinstall the galleries at the minute, but I'm hoping that will be an opportunity in the future.
That's so exciting. If I had opportunities to get to Alabama, I would look forward to being surprised by whatever you do with the collection next. If we have any other questions from the audience, we have a little bit of time left if people want to put anything in.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised, I don't think. So I don't think there are.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Maggie. It's been a delight to hear from you about this. And as Nicola said, I'm also gutted that I cannot be in St. Louis walking around it. But yeah, thank you so much for talking to us. And to everyone else watching, as we said before, you can find our Instagram page or look at other talks on YouTube. And also keep an eye out for future events in the fall. We are hoping to do another event with St. Louis Art Museum about paintings on stone. So keep an eye out for that one. Yes, thank you very much for coming and have a nice evening.
Yes, thank you, Maggie.
Thank you so much for having me. This is delightful.
Goodbye, and thank you to all the attendees.